but what is cemented with the blood of slaves? It should be said today of King's College London that the blood of enslaved Caribbean people is mixed into the mortar of its foundations. What has slavery to do with kings? We have some very precise indications. The foundations of King's College London was based on donations of money and the purchase of £100 shares by wealthy friends, which amounted to about £50,000 by late 1828, and about twice this was needed to build the King's Building by 1831. A significant component of these donors, we now know, were people who were rich because they owned and exploited enslaved people in the West Indies. As you all know, when slavery ended in the British Empire between 1834 and 38, slaveholders received £20 million in compensation for the loss of their property. Over a decade ago, an ingenious historian at UCL called Nick Draper, in a collaboration with Catherine Hall, and later through a large research project on the legacies of British slave ownership, began to follow the money and to track who received compensation. Draper, in Appendix 11 of The Price of Emancipation, his 2010 monograph, provides a 4-page correlation of subscribers to King's College London with recipients of compensation. Charles Palmer, for example, one of the earliest and most generous donors, donated £100 and bought £500 in shares, which is, roughly speaking, about £40,000 in our money. But he received the compensation of about £400,000 in our money for the 300 enslaved people he owned in Jamaica. And he was not just a beneficiary of slavery. He was a vehement apologist for it, not only opposing abolitionists, but even standing in the House of Commons in 1816 to urge the forceful repression of the Barbados slave revolt. Overall, Draper estimates somewhere between 10% of the founding subscriptions to King's College London were direct named recipients of slave compensation after 1834. Their donations were tortured from the bodies of slaves. We are built in part on the proceeds of a crime against humanity. That circa 10% estimate of our origins in slave-derived wealth is only the hard minimum. The profits of slave trading and plantation slavery since the 17th century had been laundered in land, in farms and mines, in the shares of private companies and public debt, in the East India Company, and investments of all kinds. Quite apart from profits, the Atlantic economy, based on slavery and the slave trade, was central to the entire economic development of the British Isles. It was in response to the slave and plantation trades that Bristol and Birmingham became European centres for brass and copper production, that Lancashire's cotton manufacture multiplied, that insurance broking began in Lloyd's Coffee House, and that banks such as Barclays and the ancestor banks of what today we call NatWest became flourishing. Recent research by Draper has shown how large numbers of annuities purchased from West Indian plantations sustained the polite lives of gentlemen and women throughout England who never imagined themselves to be slaveholders. While Pat Hudson has shown how bills of exchange and credit networks, which bound London into the larger English financial sector, were anchored in slavery. Contemporaries were quite clear about this, even of today, if you remember. At the end of the 17th century, Sir Dalby Thomas declared, "Sugar has contributed more to England's pleasure, glory, and grandeur than any other commodity we deal in or produce, wool not excepted." By the middle of the 18th century, the political economist Malachi Postlethwaite described British commerce as, and I quote, "a magnificent superstructure of American trade and naval power on an African foundation." So, of the 85 to 90% of subscriptions to kings that have no direct link, so far, with post-1834 slave compensation, we can be confident that the wealth underpinning them was linked in small and large ways to the enslavement, torture, and premature deaths of people in Africa, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Did kings' debts to people who worked under conditions of violence and degradation end in 1829? It is highly unlikely, if we choose to include more indirect benefit. The development of kings after 1829 took place in a world in which the forms of domination and exploitation created by plantation slavery continued to organize how people lived rich while others died poor. British merchants and financiers were key players, for example, after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, in the cotton, tobacco, sugar, and coffee economies of the United States, Cuba, and Brazil, which remained based on African slavery for decades after British emancipation. And in territories under the Union Jack, the reproduction of inequality based on slavery, experienced as race and class, continued to create vast majorities of people who lived in persistent poverty, from 1838 to the political independence of the West Indies in the 1960s. Within Britain, wealth derived from slavery and added to by forms of unequal economic benefits in India and Africa and Latin America cascaded through the generations and anchored the capacity of private and public actors to invest in education. So kings flourished in a world in which the commanders of capital and the counters of profit were white and British, while others were marked by their skin colour as the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, and as the objects of coercive violence. Let us, however, retreat to that solid 10% of our seed capital in 1829, and recognize this makes the people of the Caribbean into holders of a stake of kings. Of course, we're in no way alone among British universities in our unquantifiable debt to slaves and other squeezed colonial labour. Elsewhere, this has been acknowledged. The University of Oxford has created a working group on Oxford and colonialism, and St. John's College, perhaps its richest college, has created a project on the colonial past. The University of Cambridge has initiated a 2-year study on how it benefited from slavery and other forms of forced labour. And the University of Glasgow in 2016 created a working group on the problem of its debts to slavery, which commissioned an inquiry which reported last year that perhaps a sum which would amount to up to £198 million in our money was received from slaveholders in the 18th and 19th century. And in August 2019, Glasgow made the announcement, setting up a new precedent for British universities, that it would commit £20 million towards a programme of reparations for slavery, centred around collaborations with the Caribbean. Clearly, King's College London did not benefit on the same scale as Glasgow. Yet if even only 10% of our seed capital had its provenance in African slavery, we need to begin to ask how we might acknowledge and respond. What should we do? What could we do? I call today for us to open a conversation about reparations for slavery and kings. That the present needs to make justice and equity for what happened in the past is an important current in contemporary ethical and political thinking. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the Mau Mau trial in Britain, and the peace process in Northern Ireland are landmarks in a new movement towards the public address of historical abuses of human rights by state and private actors. The call for reparations for slavery is, however, not a sudden 21st century fashion. As Ana Lucia Araújo, perhaps the most important comparative historian of reparations, shows, former slaves and their descendants demanded redress and compensation for unremunerated labor, pain, suffering, abuse, and death from as early as the 18th century, and significantly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This impetus took new forms over the 20th century, as new obligations emerged in customary international law for states which violated international humanitarian law to make reparation for any loss or injury suffered. Important precedents were set by Germany undertaking to pay reparations to survivors of slave labor and the Holocaust, and to the State of Israel after 1945. And decades later, the United States agreed to pay reparations to the Japanese who had been unjustly interned in the United States. Reparations for the damage done by colonialism was first demanded decades ago. In the 1960s, Sir Ellis Clarke, the distinguished Trinidad jurist, declared to the United Nations, an administering power is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony. And when that has been done, to relieve itself of its obligations by the conferment of a formal but meaningless because it cannot possibly be supported, political independence. Justice requires that reparation be made to the country that has suffered the ravages of colonialism before that country is expected to face up to the problems and difficulties that will inevitably beset it upon independence. It cannot be said that Britain then or since has acknowledged any such responsibility. In the late 20th century, African American and Caribbean political actors began to ask why this principle of repairing past injustice by by present economic transfers was not applied to the slave trade, slavery, and their legacies. In 2005, the General Assembly, after all, General Assembly of the United Nations, in Resolution 60/147, established the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law. In 2013, the historian Sir Hilary Beckles urged that the 1951 Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany be taken as a model for the African diaspora, and he published a monograph, Britain's Black Debt. In September 2013, the governments of the Caribbean community created a reparations commission, and a year later, CARICOM, which is to say the Caribbean community, announced that it would pursue legal action through the International Court of Justice against the governments of Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and other historic slaveholding and slave trading powers. Apart from these state-mediated reparations claims, there are wider claims, in particular in the United States, for reparations to be paid to individuals of African descent. These state-to-state and personal claims for reparations face considerable difficulties inherent in the problem of the centuries which separate us from the immediate victims and beneficiaries of slavery. Who in 2019 will pay what to whom and how? Will, as Arajau asks, the descendants of the big men of West Africa, who got rich on selling slaves to Europeans, and I would add, the descendants of the free-colored and free blacks who owned slaves in the Caribbean, receive compensation? And will black, brown, or mixed-race French or English or Dutch people, or the descendants of poor whites, be taxed to pay compensation? Clearly, this is a very difficult issue to even imagine an easy resolution of. But if we move from thinking about states to consider what lawyers call moral persons, that is to say, immortal entities, like banks and universities, the question of reparations acquires a new purchase. It's important to emphasize that reparations is not exclusively, or even primarily, about the payment of money. Even if some address of the material inequality produced by slavery and reproduced by its legacies seems an essential part of any serious commitment to restorative justice. The 10-point plan issued by Caribbean governments in 2014 begins with a demand for a formal apology and goes on to seek the healing of the psychological damage which is the recurrent legacy of slavery. At the heart of reparations is the idea of repair. Repair of damage caused by past injustice, which continues often in the form of present injustice. It is a call for repair of the world. It is also a call for repair of ourselves. This is a call which I do not believe King's College London can ethically refuse to answer. What is there to repair for which we bear responsibility in the present and not just the past? To answer this, I begin by taking you to Tate Modern, to the Fons Americanus, the American fountain, the scandalous sculpture of Cara Williams, which opened earlier this month. As you walk in the Turbine Hall, you first meet a shell grotto, in the interstices of which, popping out of a niche, is an African boy, a dripping tear running perpetually from his right eye. Or is the eye a wound that sees, a wound that drips insight, a wound that cannot heal yet? As you walk past the arch, you reach the monumental bulk of the main piece. The first thing you see in a circuit is the goddess, a kind of mamiwata in white marble, with water jetting from her mouth and each breast, a seated man like a maroon chief, and in place of the heroic dolphins of Britannia's triumphs, the ominous circling sharks. Those of you who've read Marcus Redica's The Slave Ship will know that the passages of the slave ships across the Atlantic were followed by schools of sharks who relied on the bodies being thrown overboard. Going clockwise, you meet a tree bough, a lynching tree with a hanging noose. One twist more, and you see that in its shadow, in the shade of death, we find a queenly woman in the agonies of giving birth to a fully formed young man. Is his destiny to become the old man below in a kiss of tender passion, or to end up as one more strange fruit hanging from the bough beside it? Looking down from above on this disturbing assemblage, we see that Walker wishes to insist that at the same time we remember the violence and horror which underpins the Atlantic world and modern Britain, that we celebrate the stubborn resilience of black humanity in its midst, and we recognize this is not just about the past, but the present, about a regime of horror which flows like a fountain across time. The trauma not only persists, but is reproduced generation after generation by all the legacies of slavery. It is perpetually rehearsed in monuments and institutions which erase and make invisible the human suffering at their foundations. If one looks across the former British colonies of the Caribbean, we find societies which are still marked profoundly by the violence of their origins, with economies which remain distorted by these origins. 8 of the 20 nation states with the highest homicide rates in the world are English-speaking Caribbean societies. So much for the benevolent legacies of Westminster democracy. In Japan, the murder rate is 0.3 per 100,000 inhabitants. In Trinidad and Tobago, it approaches 30, and in Jamaica, it's 40. These are societies with high rates of structural unemployment and high rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, linked to the nutritional legacies of the plantation. The University of the West Indies, a federal institution which educates the descendants of the slaves who helped found Kings, has an endowment and reserves which are a tiny fraction of our own. Here in Britain, we live an experience called race, produced in the experience of slavery and colonialism, which reproduces the spirit of these regimes of domination across time. To live in a body which is racialized as black is to be born with poorer life chances, to be marked as dangerous, twice as likely to be unemployed, if employed to earn on average about 87% of white men, more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, more likely to be punished for any delinquency, more likely to be excluded from school, less likely to receive credit, more likely to be the object of violence. Black people are 4 times more likely than whites to be detained under the Mental Health Act, 25% more likely if arrested to be remanded in custody, 4 times more likely than their proportion of the population to be in prison, and once in custody, 2 to 3 times as likely to die there. In 2014, there were 2,600 black men in prison in Britain. The number of their under 30 peers at that time in university was only slightly higher, at about 3,000. And once in university, across the UK, 30% of white students graduated in 2018 with first-class honours, versus 14% of those who identified as black. Well, there are obviously complex reasons for these outcomes, but we need to address them. What about us at King's? I sat there in front of a large lecture room at the beginning of this academic year in which we had gathered our collected first year. As I looked out, I saw very, very few students who were visibly of African diaspora origin. And here we are in London, in one of the great centres of African diaspora life. Now, the origins of this are, of course, all complicated, but they cannot be unrelated to the problem of the racial and social origins of those who in the vast majority teach here, and to how thinly our curriculum addresses the world outside of Europe. And in our coverage, we are well ahead of most British universities. King's is in many ways an institution with a white face. It is structurally white, the pitiful wall of BAME and the enlarged image of Desmond Tutu notwithstanding. Do all our students and staff feel the same sense of ease here? The sense of the right to be here? Or do some feel in small or large ways marginal, latecomers to the feast, poor in the cultural capital of one kind or another which we appear to value? When someone publishes something in and for Caribbean readers, or publishes something in or for Caribbean African readers, do our colleagues value it as highly as something published in and for and in the manners of the global north? Looking outwards, why are the vast majority of King's external relations directed to the global north and so little to the Caribbean and Africa? You might say, because there aren't so many great universities there. Well, what are we doing about it? We are in so many ways part of the means through which structures of inequality, many of them in fact grounded in an original sense in slavery and colonialism, are reproduced in the world. This is part of the past which lives in the present, but if we choose, it need not be the future. Because reparations is not ultimately about the past. It is about the future. Towards what future which challenges the long legacies of slavery and seeks to make good the damage in which we are complicit will kings work, build, and invest? Now, I cannot answer how Kings will repair itself and repair its world. A serious response would require a process through which a working party, empowered by senior management to make an investigation, would offer a report and recommendations. But I can sketch one possible path we might follow. There will need to be resources for any serious project of reparations. This may involve the reallocation of resources from other objectives, because the future is always about choices. The University of Glasgow has chosen to commit £20 million to its programme of reparations. Of course, Glasgow is very rich. In 2018, the 6th richest British university. But King's is the 5th richest. And it has seen its endowment more than doubled since 2010 to about £230 million. What if, for a period of 10 years, the income stream of 10% of our reserves was directed towards forms of institution building which are part of a programme of reparations for slavery? Note that I'm not proposing the transfer of capital, merely that for a period of time, King's chooses to acknowledge its forgotten Caribbean and African diaspora stakeholders by directing its growth, by choosing how it builds and remakes itself towards new initiatives which seek to repair the Caribbean, the African diaspora, in particular in Britain and in itself, assigning a budget of £1 million a year to these ends. This may seem a lot of money, but I remind you that King's expenditure annually is somewhere around £840 million. If we wanted to avoid the likely outrage of the Daily Mail reader, it might simply be called the King's Caribbean and African Diaspora Initiative. I see two main directions for reparatory action. First, half the resources committed should go to repairing King's relationship with Black Britain and the African diaspora. Item 4 of our strategic priorities declares that we prioritise the idea of being a civic university in the heart of London by 2029, quote unquote. Well, of course, we could begin by serving that priority by taking down the security barriers, which, unlike at UCL and the LSE, deny the people of London access to our spaces. But beyond that, why can't we build a pipeline which would begin in majority BAME schools in London, where we would encourage high ambition and high achievement, which would continue in university through mentoring, through support, and would go on to funded graduate and postdoctoral studentships. Within the university, we can commit in the arts and humanities and social science departments to more academic posts which are focused on the Caribbean, the African diaspora, and the Black and Brown experience in Britain, to making ourselves immediately relevant to the students we want to attract, while giving the educational experience of non-minority students a wider and richer purchase on the world. King's medical side might commit more resources to diseases like sickle cell anemia and malaria, and to addressing the mental health consequences of racialized inequality. We have much work to do in confronting the forms of structural racism which even with the best liberal wills we continue to agree to work within. Second, the other half of the resources should go to building King's engagement with the Caribbean and Africa. Why should King's College London not aspire to become Britain's main university for the Caribbean, to have a special vocation for the region? There are historic precedents for this. Many distinguished Caribbean figures, such as Harold Moody, sometimes called the Martin Luther King of Britain, who we will honour in the last week of Black History Month at King's this year, and Sir Shriedath Ramphel, have been products of King's. Under the old Federal University of London, King's had a much closer partnership with the then University College of the West Indies than it does today. Why should we not build a special relationship with the University of the West Indies? We need funding for the students and staff of the University of the West Indies to come and learn from and teach us. I've never had a student come as a graduate student over 10 years from the Caribbean. And I think a lot of that has to do with funding. When they do come, they go to places which have managed to fund them. Part of the historical legacy of the colonial experience, for example, is that their researchers must come to London to do research, since the vast majority of the archival sources of Caribbean history are held here in the British National Archives, but also in our Mon Library, which keeps the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Library as part of its collection. We could provide some support for these visits while participating in projects for the digital repatriation of these resources. We need funding to support the other direction, to allow students and staff in every discipline to learn from and to contribute to the Caribbean and Africa. But apart from these initiatives, there's work to be done in remaking ourselves towards a more inclusive future. What can we do about the aesthetics and the visual culture of kings? How can we make present and visible the forms, bodies, and artistic style of the Caribbean and Africa? Should we not, in lieu of an apology, commission a sculptor to design a memorial for the foyer of the King's Building to the long-forgotten enslaved people who, in part, made possible our origins? I'd like to end on a personal note. The post I occupy is called the Rhodes Professorship of Imperial History. It was founded 100 years ago this year. But here's the curious thing. The Rhodes Trust gave very little, and this memorial to Cecil Rhodes is therefore renewed from year to year by the college's general expenditure, which is to say, by the fees that you pay. It is time now for the college to create a process to give a new name to the chair. It might be called after Walter Rodney, perhaps the most distinguished Caribbean historian to be produced by the University of London. Or it might be named after Kenneth Dike, the Igbo Nigerian historian who founded the Ibadan School of History Historians, who is perhaps the most important African diaspora product of the Rhodes Chair. Or one of the previous incumbents, such as Peter Marshall, who lectured for this department for 50 consecutive years, might be honored in whole or in part. Whatever name we choose, it is through processes like this that we begin a process of repair. Repair of the world, repair of ourselves, to make a world in which everyone can live as equals, with their humanity fully acknowledged, and with equal means for the flowering of their gifts. Thank you.